The following podcast may be explicit. One Joe Young presents Adventures from the Shed, a tabletop RPG podcast. You can find us online at adventuresfromtheshed.com. Welcome to another Adventures from the Shed Sidebar podcast. For today's recording session, we were missing Brit, so Joe decided to have a quick sidebar recording to discuss how to proceed when a player is absent. Enjoy the podcast.
Hi, and welcome to the Shed for Adventures from the Shed. We're going to do a special sidebar here while we eat some lunch in between recording some other sessions. Today, we are missing one of our podcast members, and we're going to do a little sidebar on how we're handling it, as well as how to handle it when one of your players can't make a play session. Also, perhaps, how we've seen this happen in the past in other games that we've played in, how different DMs, GMs handle it. Of course, you can find us online at adventuresfromtheshed.com, on iTunes, Facebook, Stitcher Radio, Google+, Bing.
That's it.
That's it. And saying that's it is, I said Google.
YouTube, right?
I don't know if I said YouTube.
YouTube.
But we're going to go around and say, do a quick hi, and with...
Hi, everyone. This is Mickie.
And...
JJ.
And... Bert. And Joe. That's me. So we are without Brit today. And we're recording 3 or 4 episodes today of Adventures from the Shed. We are in the middle of our Alamont campaign. For those who hear this, we are recording this sidebar right after we just recorded episode 20. I'm going to say it's 29, but it's close to that. Because we had 25, then we had 26 and 27, which was Pirates and Demons, and then 28 was the one we just recorded. So this would be between 28 and 29, essentially. We just played one session without Elena, our party member there, and I'll start this by just mentioning how I'm handling it so far, because we have a couple more hours, probably 2 to 3 more hours of recording, and we're keeping the character in the story. So for those who have heard the episode that we just recorded, Elena was found unconscious on the street. I'm linking that to a spell, or specifically a ritual, that Nessalus had cast that cost the... I'll say it this way. It cost the consciousness of Elena as part of the price of that ritual. So during the day, she was walking down the street, and while Nessalus kicked that ritual off, it pulled Elena into a coma. And part of that was taking that ritual stamp that JJ was kind enough to draw for us and put that on her forehead. And they found her in a temple. So I'm trying to use the character without necessarily needing the player there. Now, for all of us, we've played, I think, in games where somebody didn't show up or someone couldn't make it. How do different GMs, DMs handle that in other games that we've played in? Or, for that matter, any game?
So you don't just kick them out?
I typically don't. I mean, I've heard all kinds of different ways to approach it, and I figure we can probably spend 15 to 30 minutes talking about that as a sidebar. While we're eating, by the way, if any of us are chewing too loud in your ear, I apologize.
We're
Right.
sorry.
So you and JJ have a lot more experience with this, but you can do what we're doing today, which is work it into the plot, and they're not an active participant. We can talk about that. If you're running a home game, depending on whether you're missing one or more players, you might run a side mission as a kind of a one shot, that's not directly related to the compelling driving storyline, but someone in town needs something done, or a dungeon needs to be cleared near town, and you go off and run essentially a self-contained one shot. Or you vote them off the island and never let them back into your game.
Vote them off the island. One of the interesting things about doing that one shot, that side, is it's to me one of the most railroaded situations, because now you've gotten yourself into this little side quest, and you have to finish it this session because the other character, quote unquote, isn't around. And if you're in the middle of that on your next game day, when that character is around, now they're left out because they're not in that special side mission.
Right.
So it can be kind of constrictive, although I have done it.
But,
Yeah.
I mean, the side mission could be something that's character-specific for character development. Like, I wouldn't be jealous. It's something specific to that particular character that furthers their skill set.
And for a single character missing, I think it's fairly easy to keep going and just make an excuse for them not being there. But if you had 2 of your 4 or 2 of your 5 not there, but people still wanted to play, that's where you might say, look, I've got this little module I picked up off drive through RPG.
He said, "But people still wanted to play."
But people.
But people.
There's
JJ drew a butt person earlier.
There's one butt person at the table today, and that's JJ Stevens.
Speaking of JJ, let me ask you a question. Have you had a time where the character who is the central point of the plot, their player doesn't show up for a session?
Yeah, I actually have, and it really throws a wrench in it. Especially if I'm using them as my spotlight. I typically do that. I'll try to shine spotlights on different characters at different times. That way everyone feels like they're important at least some point in the campaign. And if they can't make it, I typically will try to reschedule it. Now, typically, whenever someone can't make it, I will do what the NPC method. They'll still be there. I will run their character as part of the combat, but they won't actually be contributing to the story at all.
I was going to ask that. So what's wrong with playing that character? So either having another player pick up that character sheet and play along, or have the DM/GM roll for that character when their turn comes up.
I can tell you the biggest thing that I've seen with it is my character wouldn't have done that.
Well, then you
That's
should
the
have
biggest
been
thing.
here.
Yes, and,
Well-
and that's where some people will tell you, well, if I'm not there, then just ignore my character.
Right.
I've had one GM that says you turn into an indestructible sugar cube for the session.
Well,
that you're not
we
there.
kind of did that with Truk. I can't remember why I couldn't be there. I think I may have been out of town, but
It's because we
You
don't
were-
like you.
yeah, early on there
You
was
were
a session
petrified.
where I couldn't be there, and you guys turned me into stone, and that not only dealt with me, but it actually became kind of the central plot point for that 3 hours.
And it's kind of the way, like I said, the way I'm kind of trying to do it with Elena. I want to keep the character in the story without anyone having to play the character. So where Truk was turned to stone by Cassidy,
So you
Medusa,
turn the absent character into a MacGuffin.
pretty much. But in this case, it allows us to tell the story without her having to say it herself. And the same thing with Truk. As being turned to stone, also at that point, it became kind of a comedy routine when Calamity also turned to stone.
Yeah.
And between Nessalus and Elena, they were positioning the statues and getting them on the travois to get to the monastery. The travois that wasn't made out of a Wylena. What do you think, Mickie, as from the player perspective, if you're not able to make it, what would you, ideally, how would you want to come back into the game at the next session? What would be most important about your character for the missing session?
I would like to know what happened at the prior session and if my character did anything during the session that I need to know about.
Yeah.
I kind of would see it, and even if, I guess this is just me, even if my character, quote unquote, did something that I wouldn't have had it do, I don't know, maybe they were possessed or they got hit on the head and they were acting kind of weird. Maybe they have multiple personalities and one of them came out that one time.
Yeah.
You move on. I wasn't there for some reason or another,
Yeah.
and you let it go. Let it go.
I think part of that can be, too, though, you've written backstories for your characters. So say sometime during a session that you weren't there, somebody said, I was an orphan as your character, when your character actually has a rich family history, but they don't know it because they don't know your backstory. Would that bug you?
Well, that would be on...
I'm pushing the boundaries to try and figure out what
that would be on me as the character, because if my character has such a rich backstory, then as the player, I failed that character by not sharing it.
I would like to hear that.
You know? Because
Nice.
the people who I play with should know whether or not my character was an orphan or not. They should know that as an extension of playing
Did
with
you
them.
know
Did
that
I?
9 out of 10 PCs are orphans?
Pretty much, yes. And you know that 11 out of 10 start in a tavern?
Yep.
And that's a whole fraction thing. You know people have problems with fractions. Yeah.
There's a couple issues. One, if you miss, do you get XP or level up for the time you're not there? If you, on the one hand, it seems unfair for you to get it. You didn't show up. You didn't spend the 5 hours. On the other hand, we don't want you to lag behind the party going forward and therefore drag the party down because you didn't get that XP. So that's an issue for the GM or for the table to address. And two, I think there's a bigger issue, which is it's not unusual for people to have to miss a game every now and then. And we are lucky in this group, in part because we understand the responsibility that we have to record, but we're pretty good about having people show up unless there's a true health issue. But there are some games where people don't show up with semi-regularity, and that's another issue for the game master to address, is if you've got a guy or a girl who doesn't show up every third week, how do you deal with that?
I think I hadn't really thought of adding this to the podcast for this sidebar, but I think it's actually important to note scheduling. I think one reason we are more successful here is because we don't have a regular schedule, to be honest. If you said we're playing every Tuesday night at 7 o'clock, it's more likely that someone's going to miss that than if everybody says, I'm available that third Saturday this month, the second Sunday next month, whatever it may be. So I hadn't thought of it from that perspective, but that could help. If you have a problem player that isn't able to show up as often as they want, and I say a problem player, it's really a problem with their schedule, most likely,
right,
and they can't show up as often as they want, maybe break away from your rigid schedule and just try and coordinate with people to try different nights.
It could be, we don't want to call anyone a problem player, but it could be two things.
One, pull back on that,
you could have a player who's not as committed to the game as you are and everyone else is, and that's a very real issue. I've been in groups where
every table has it. Everyone.
Right, you have the one guy who he wants to play but he doesn't really care about it, and at some point you've got to fish or cut bait on that guy, and you got to figure out
let me just interject for a moment. It's not necessarily that, because to be fair, JJ doesn't care for the Dungeon World that much. We know that. But he's doing great in the podcast, so it's not necessarily if someone likes it or not. It's whether they're participating.
Yeah.
So I just want to
Are they coming to play, or are they coming to socialize?
And JJ does a great job in playing a game that isn't his fancy, so to speak.
Right. So I would not consider him an issue at all, because he shows up, he's committed, he's not on his phone, he's down for whatever.
Mickey's on her phone
I'm on my phone right now.
as he said it. Yeah.
But I've been in games where there's one guy at the table who doesn't come a quarter of the time, and half the time he's there, he's on his phone. And at some point, it's just not fun to play with that player.
They need to be engaged somewhere.
Yeah, and so then that's kind of a group dynamic issue that maybe is beyond the scope of this little sidebar, but I think that's something that you have to deal with. But number two is just the pure scheduling issue, and that's something if you have a player who really wants to be there, and I mean, I'm probably the hardest one in our group because I got 2 kids and I've got a wife who, it's awesome, but there's only so much time she's going to let me take away at a game. So we've been pretty good about scheduling around me to a large degree, whereas other groups might not have done that, and it's just kind of the way it is.
And on the flip side, JJ has a wife and they are 2 kids.
Yeah, exactly.
And this makes it awesome for us.
We are 2 kids. You're right.
Mickie.
But I think it's to your earlier point. We don't have a set schedule, and that's something that maybe people need to consider. When you sit down and you plan a game, it's hard to say let's play every other Thursday, because something's going to happen on that Thursday where one or more of your players are not going to be able to get together. Maybe instead of saying, let's play every other Thursday, let's play it by ear. And it's a little scary when you get adults together and you tell them, let's play it by ear. But I think it starts with that commitment. So why are you playing? Well, everyone at the table wants to play the game.
We're implicitly or explicitly committed to 4 to 6 hours of recording per month. So we know we've got to get 4 to 6 hours one way or the other. So while we are very flexible on a week-to-week basis, when push comes to shove, if we don't have the episodes, we all make the time to be here. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you're just running your little home game of the starter set or, whatever, maybe that works, maybe it doesn't. I don't know.
Now, on the issue of player commitment, we were talking about, do you give XP if they're not there and everything? It depends on whether or not you're using XP as the reward. I've been part of the games where the DMs were incredibly stingy with XP, and not showing up was a huge detriment because then you start to lag behind. And I've been part of the games where it didn't matter. Once one person leveled up, everybody leveled up.
Yeah, and that's what I do typically in the podcast, because I think it's more fun in the podcast for everyone to be at a similar level.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So, I mean, do you need to use the whip / apple of XP to entice your players to come? Because if that's the issue, then you may not have the right group.
Or you need to reevaluate your DM approach.
And that could be too, right? Maybe you have missing players because of the way you handle it when they're missing. And they don't want to come back to the table because, well, I didn't get to level up. Everyone else did. I was looking so forward to another D10 of hit points and that new spell and that new ability, and I got denied because my kid had the flu or something. And that's, I guess that's a decent point. Now, when that player doesn't show up, though, what other tricks should a GM have up their sleeve to handle it when a player doesn't show up?
Flexibility. Always be flexible.
Now, a lot of it's always going to depend on the story that's going on at the time.
Yeah.
But we're playing a separate game that JJ's running right now in D&D 5th edition. In our first session, one of our characters wasn't there, and we learned, at least I learned in the second session, that character had some extracurricular activities. JJ, how did you handle that for the character that wasn't there for the first
I
session?
actually ran an individual session for her.
Yeah.
And it was just a one-on-one, and that's how I typically deal with missing people, is I will talk with them outside of the game and try to establish what a plausible reason for why they were missing, and then attempt to do something story-driven, kind of like what you did. You're still including them in the story, but whereas they don't have a say currently in our Alamon game, mine, they do have a say because I make the effort outside the game to approach them, to accommodate them, to keep them in the story.
Right. Which seems like an ideal response, but also not realistic for a lot of DMs who barely have enough time to run the game that they're running.
Yeah.
To do a private session is above and beyond. But in a perfect world, that's awesome. And in fact, in that particular game, because I also play in it, it's going to work really nicely because, one, she got her XP. Two, she's got a little bit of a backstory, which is a mystery or intrigue for the rest of us to figure out. And it's going to work great. I imagine most DMs are not going to have the time to do that.
Sometimes, so you can handle it even through email.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
There was
Email
one
or IM.
night, and I'm glad Mickie mentioned it, because there's one, I don't know if you can remember this along with me, Mickie, but we had, when we did our D&D family reunion, Mickie was working late that day. It was a day she actually showed up in their high heels and her work dress, if you remember that.
Yeah.
I remember it fondly. But she was going to be late. So we started the story, and I did this with Mickie through email ahead of time. Is it okay if Brit is captured by the dragon cultists so that everyone else has to go rescue her? I think by the email tone, I felt like Mickie was a little wary about the damsel in distress deal, but she agreed with it. So we were able.
We all know how well I play the damsel in distress.
So we were able to work that out ahead without too much extra time, as long as people are willing to do that communication. Yeah. If I had sent the email and she didn't reply, or if she had sent it and I didn't reply, that would have hurt if either of us didn't have the time.
Well, and which raises an important point I meant to bring up earlier. If you were going to miss a game, there's a big difference between emailing the GM the morning of the game and saying, dude, I can't make it today, something came up, or I can't make it today, I've got the stomach virus, and emailing 4 days before and saying, look, my schedule's not going to allow me to play this week. And I would just say, for those of you who are players, the more advanced notice you can give your game master that you're not going to be able to attend, the better, because then that allows us to have this thought process and this conversation happen.
Especially the way I play as GM. Also, if you can add to that, I'm not going to be there, but if you could have my character do X, even better.
Yeah.
It helps set the stage. The GM then knows that you wanted your character to keep hunting that sword, that the mythical sword that everyone's looking for. And we can, to JJ's point, where he'll play them as an NPC, which personally I don't like to, but if you're playing them as an NPC, now you actually know what they're wanting to do, and you can fulfill what they wanted without having to steer it any specific.
But Joe, you know, as a DM, I tend to play all my characters anyways.
Yes. JJ will play everyone's character at one point or another.
That's in your wheelhouse, babe.
And for those who are not familiar with this, check out any of our sidebars where JJ ran the sessions, where he could describe to everybody what their character should have been doing that round. And he does a really good job of making sure of that. It actually, and I know it's a little bit of a sidebar on the sidebar, but that helps design encounters too, knowing what the characters can do. There's a lot of times that I fail on encounter design because I leave the characters so much in the hands of the players that I don't even know what they can do. And then I'll have an encounter that doesn't work out. Whether a player has a character there or not may not even affect it.
Well, it also explains why Mickie is so much enjoying the Dominate spell.
I mean, I guess that kind of leads into, like you said, a little bit more of a sidebar. Is how heavy of a hand does the DM need to have within his characters?
Within the player's characters?
Yeah, within his player's characters.
I get part of that comes down to what I was saying, where if the player isn't there, I tend not to make the character do anything. I will allow things to happen around the character, which what we're doing with Elena's comatose state right now, where things are happening around her, but technically nothing is happening to her. If Brit were to show up now, we could pick it up where she regains consciousness on the table and everything's at normal. But to be able to keep that story going, I used the character as part of the ritual price.
Well, JJ's question is interesting, just knowing him, because I think I heard him kind of saying, how much control as a GM can I have over my players, particularly if I know my players are screwing up how they should be playing or underutilizing their characters. And I think the sense I got was, I want to have this level of control or at least input, whereas when he's on the player side, if you do anything that cuts into his player agency or his character agency, it's super offensive and problematic. and I'm not pointing that out as a criticism, but simply just as a comment that some players, particularly those who are knowledgeable of the game, really want a level of control. And I think part of the challenge of our game is balancing how we control our player, our character, or if we're the GM, how we control our role to still let everyone at the table have fun.
And how do you handle that character when that player isn't able to make it? The one who needs that agency more than perhaps others. Yeah. Where Mickie was saying, I don't care what happens to my character, just let me explain it after.
Then that's where you...
There's a difference.
Right, whereas I would never want to role play JJ's character when he wasn't here.
Yeah, that's when you have, isn't there an internet video where they have the bard who's just kind of just standing there?
It's the barbarian, actually, yeah.
Yeah, he's kind of just standing there in the background.
It's a movie that they did the tabletop and then they acted it out after, kind of like what we did with the Christmas special.
Halloween.
Or the Halloween special. And the barbarian shows up late. And so he's just an NPC following everyone around, just doing nothing, just literally being a pack mule. And then the barbarian comes in and his party is literally almost dead. He comes awake and rages out and manages to save the party from a TPK.
Nice.
And I think as a GM, you know you should at least know the players at your table and know who's going to wig out when you play their character and who's going to just be like, whatever.
And that's part of something we talked about before, about being a GM and things we've said in other sidebars. The more you get to know your players and the more you talk to them, especially setting expectations. It works both at a job and it works at a gaming table where we're going to spend a whole day together. So it's good to know what our expectations are. If somebody expects their character to always be involved, and when they're not there, you just put their character on the back burner, they might actually get upset. They might want their character played by somebody just so it's always out there in the forefront. So it's definitely a good thing to know the people in order to get that done. I don't know, what's a good way to put it? Diplomatically.
There you go.
You want to make sure that you're handling each one as they would want to be handled, but that involves a high degree of knowing the players, which can be difficult for new people.
I have a friend who plays in a very, very long-standing Pathfinder game. Very long. They've been playing for years. And they have one player who shows up but isn't really there and is on his phone, is on his laptop, and does stupid stuff in combat. And I just know it's super frustrating to those guys who are really invested in the game. And again, this may be another topic, but I'd be curious how game masters kind of deal with that guy at some point. But it may be beyond the scope of what we're talking about here.
Are you trying to tell me something?
No, no.
You're always doing something stupid in combat.
We have no one like that here.
Yeah.
I think that's a hard situation.
So is there any other ways that anyone here has seen a DM or a GM handle a missing player? How do they handle the character when the player is not there? So I mentioned one where I was in a campaign where this DM says, you become this invincible sugar cube. And that was just his explanation. You sit there, and if you show up in the story, the sugar cube turns back into the character. In the meantime, nothing can happen to it, but it's always along with the party. And, I thought it was kind of weird, but it's also a nice little simple explanation to tell everyone at the table, this is what happens when you're not here. It's a hard and fast rule. Your character can't do anything, etc. So it's one, I think, pretty strict way to handle it that could be very useful for a variable table of different players.
So do you establish those rules up front?
Yeah. I mean, to me, when I played that game, it was established up front.
think we've hit what we can hit today.
You think?
I think so.
Anything you want to add, Mr. Stevens?
I'm trying to think, but no, I haven't
I'm
really.
trying to think. Ain't working.
That's. I mean, we've hit pretty much every method that you can do. At least all the ones I've observed.
Cool. So what I'll do is we'll wrap this one up. I'll toss this sidebar at the on the same day that we release the episode we just recorded, where we talked about Elena here and used that character in the episode. But in the meantime, we'll say thanks for listening and
Bye, everyone.
Goodbye, everybody.
Feel better, Brittany.
Several ideas were tossed around and discussed, including our own example of handling a missing player in our Alamon Dungeon World campaign. Hopefully we helped with suggestions for others. Let us know. Thanks for joining us. The preceding podcast was brought to you by One Joe Young. You can find us online at adventuresfromtheshed.com.